Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Yokes. We don't hear that word much, do we? Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. A yoke is a two-horse, a two-mule harness, if you will, placed over the shoulders of animals that were used, of course, to plow the fields. Over the past few days, I've been a bit busy planning the 3 funerals that will take place here at the Church of St. Mary this coming week. And during the planning of one of those funerals, I was visiting with the spouse of the deceased loved one, and the spouse said of his deceased loved one, "You know, Father Steve, I can summarize it all with this one phrase. We were a great team in harness." We were a great team in harness. It's what he was talking about. It's what Jesus is talking about. The yoke, the harness, only works if there are 2 together in the harness, pulling and doing the work that needs to be done. So is it any wonder then that Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light," because if you and I take any time to examine the life of Jesus Christ in the scriptures, you and I would say his burden was anything but light, his yoke anything but easy. So how could he say such an outlandish thing in our gospel today? The reason Jesus could say this because he was always in rhythm with his Father in heaven. Jesus was always recognizing that the harness, the yoke, the cross that was put on his shoulders could only be carried if he was in rhythm with the God who had sent him, with the God who had loved him into being, with the God who was the voice that said, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." So Jesus was always about the 2-person harness. So much so that, of course, that's what makes the burden easy and the yoke easy as well. But it's hard for you and I, isn't it? It's hard for you and I to move in that direction, to be in rhythm with our God who created us as well, who, of course, enabled you and I to be who we are today. It's hard because, of course, we're learned and we're wise. And Jesus tells us today that's not always such a good thing. Because oftentimes, the more learned and the more wise we become, the more difficult it is for you and I to realize that we need help pulling the harness. We need help carrying the yoke, which is life itself. Because all of us suffer from what a good friend of mine, who's a psychologist, says is the disease we are all afflicted with, and that is the God never sleeps disease. And the first time that my friend said that, I looked at him and I said, "I don't understand." He said, "Exactly. It's because you're too learned and you're too wise." God never sleeps disease means that you and I as human beings, why we like to be God, and so of course, even though we might choose to let our body sleep, our mind is constantly going. Our mind is constantly trying to figure it out, constantly trying to be in control of the events of life itself. We're constantly trying to make sure that everything goes exactly as we want it to go, exactly as we plan it to go. And so even though at night when we close our eyes and we desire to find rest for ourselves, our mind just keeps on working. And it keeps on moving. Because of course, when we have that mind set, we think we need to be God. And so we fall into the God never sleeps syndrome. We're always thinking we need to be in charge. We need to be in control for fear that if we're not, everything will crumble as we know it. But let me ask you this question. Would that be such a bad thing if everything crumbled as you and I know it? Perhaps it's then that we begin to realize that we need help, that we need to pick up the yoke, the harness that requires more than just you and I to be in it. It's at those moments that we begin to realize that through the help of a God who loves us, through the help of a spouse that walks with us, through the help of family members who love us, through the help of friends and neighbors that care for us, it is then that we together pick up the yoke and we carry it. And then we are amazed. We are truly amazed at how light that burden has become, how easy that yoke can be to carry, if we're just mindful of the fact that it takes more than just ourselves to carry it, to lift it, to go through life and its burdens alone is not where we will find rest. No, Jesus invites you and I to come to him, to learn from him, to take his yoke upon our shoulders, and our burden will become light.